Now, I want you to look on the other hand at a church in Smyrna. And there are very few churches in the book of Revelations, in these 7 churches. There are only 2 out of 7 that get very little reprimand. Smyrna is one of those. But I'll tell you what, Smyrna is not a place where I would want to necessarily be. Smyrna is in a city where hostility exists. Let's turn in our Bibles to Revelation chapter 2, begin in verse 8. To the angel of the church of Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation, your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested for 10 days. You will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. So you see, here's a conflict. As I said, I would not want to be a member of the Church of Smyrna. There's trouble coming. They've already suffered, and there's still trouble. On the surface, as we might look at this church, we'd say this congregation's in trouble. They're going to be killed. They're going to die. They're financially on the rocks. They're in poverty. History tells us that this was the smallest of the churches that John wrote to. And so what does Jesus see? When Jesus looks at this, there's problems that exist in this church. Not necessarily within the congregation, but within the community around them. Hostility towards Christianity. The Bible tells us some of them died, and some of them were about to be put to death, and some of them would be in prison. Certainly not a place that I would desire to go. Although, I do have to say this. Again, I'm not trying to, I just want to express to you, if you ever want to feel like you have suffered with Christ, go to a pride event and try to hand out a gospel tract. I'm not saying it's an effective evangelistic tool. But I will tell you that when you leave after you've been cussed at and spit at and all of this other stuff, you realize that you've had the opportunity to suffer with Christ, at least in a very small, minuscule way. So, I think that's what these Christians in Smyrna were seeing. Some of them, as I mentioned, are going to be arrested. They're going to go to jail. Revelation says 10 days. Whether it's a literal 10 or a figurative 10, I do not know. But God says this church was a success. This group of Christians were successful. Notice what God says. There's a couple things. He says, you are rich. I want to read this for you. He says, I know your tribulation and your poverty. Speaking in a literal sense. He says, but you are rich. Friends, how wealthy a congregation is has nothing to do with the bank account. Oh, sure, it's good to pay the bills, good to keep the lights on, good to keep the doors open. But we can be the poorest people in the world, and we can be the richest spiritually. I think that's what God saw in this church. In verse 9, it tells us that they stood for the truth. Now, that's something very difficult to do in Smyrna. He says, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. See, they were slandered. That word slander means blasphemed. There were people that were saying these Christians are horrible. and they wanted to kill them. Jesus, only thing that Jesus instructed these Christians to do, he didn't instruct them to be better teachers. He didn't instruct them to change their hearts like so many of the other churches. What Jesus tells them to do is be faithful unto death. Remain steadfast. I don't know. Maybe I do want to be a member of the Church of Smyrna. I'll tell you, it's not going to be easy. And lastly, he says, if you overcome. Lastly, in verse 11, Jesus says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. We know, if we go to the back of the book of Revelations, that second death is hell. Jesus says, if you overcome, you will not be hurt by the fires of hell. What an encouragement to a church that suffers.